They for us, we have a special guest, Dr. Melissa Nemon from Merrimack College, who's going to share with us some insights of transdisciplinary research that they conduct at Merrimack College and how they are able to bring the university and the community together for solving, of course, societal challenges and for making an impact and a change to the communities. This is also in line with the University of Pretoria's goal on impact and making societal change. And I think for us at Mamelodi campus, this is so relevant because in our engagement, community engagement research and community engagement activities, we are looking to use transdisciplinarity as a tool to make sure that we make an impact and also to ensure that we really transform our societies. We know that our communities are plagued by poverty, high unemployment rates, and just the use of drugs and things like that. So we're hoping that we can learn from universities such as Merrimack College, with whom we have a partnership and with whom we've already implemented some successful projects. So welcome, Dr. Nemon. We hope that we didn't wake you up very early. I know in Massachusetts it's probably very early and dark, but yeah, here we are already ushering the afternoon.
Well, okay.
We look forward to
I'm sorry, Prof. Okay. So thank you. Perhaps I'm just muted, Prof, by mistake. I was running up and down here with the link. I'm asking Melissa, thank you very much for being willing to present today. And I ask it also to tell us a little bit about her career and what she's doing. Over to you, Melissa.
Fantastic. Thank you, Martina. Hello. Good afternoon for all of you. For me, it's good morning. I hope that I hope you're all doing well. We are going to talk today about transdisciplinary research, but I just want to introduce myself a little bit. I am a professor of community economic development. That's what my doctorate is in, with a specialization in research and evaluation. I've been teaching at Merrimack for about 8 years now. In their community engagement department. I also teach at one other school. So I actually jump between 2 different schools in Massachusetts. In addition to my teaching, in which I specialize in program evaluation and community engagement and social movements and social justice, I also am an evaluator and researcher, which I run Nemon Consulting, which I founded about 17 years ago, in which I work with the federal government, United States government, state governments, local nonprofits, nationwide nonprofits in the US, and a couple NGOs to assess and evaluate different programs or projects in the areas and communities that they work in. And that kind of runs the gamut of everything from, sometimes we're looking at youth programs, sometimes we're looking at poverty, sometimes we're looking at housing, but it's how they're all interlinked together. And it's exciting that I get to talk today about transdisciplinary research, because at least here in a lot of the schools I'm connected with, and a lot of the nonprofits and government work that I do, transdisciplinary research seems to be the trend. It seems to be where we're moving towards, which is rather exciting, because for a long time, academia really sat in the ivory tower, right? So you've got researchers and scientists who kind of sit in academia and they do their work and they do their research, and very seldom is it either driven or connected directly to actual solution making in the community. And we're seeing a pretty major shift in terms of how we're rethinking what research looks like. and that's going to change a lot of different things. It's a paradigm shift. It's going to change a lot of perspectives and a lot of ideas. Oops, I'm sorry. I think somebody's coming through. And so it's going to change a lot of ideas and a lot of perceptions on how we do research. So that's a little bit about me. Again, I kind of sit in both worlds. I have a foot in consulting and research on the ground in communities, and I have a foot in academia. So it's been exciting to see this sort of happen more on the academic side rather than just the community-based side. So first thing, I just want to be clear, I'm going to cover what transdisciplinary research is. I think a lot of the content around transdisciplinary research seems intuitive until you start to understand that it is slightly different than interdisciplinary research. I think these two get mixed up a lot. And so we're going to just talk definitions and sort of understand it a little bit. And then I'm going to go through what are some of the goals or what are some of the characteristics of transdisciplinary research, and then talk about some challenges, because there's challenges as well as opportunities. And then lastly, I'm going to go through some examples. And then I would like to open up a little bit to a discussion about where you're thinking, what this is making you think about, what are some of the concerns or thoughts that you have about this particular topic. So first off, let's get definitions out of the way. So Harvard School of Public Health sort of has stepped into the fray here. To be clear, transdisciplinary research has been around since at least the 1970s. It's about 50 years old. It has not had as much success in getting understood or known as participatory research, even though it includes participatory research. But certain sectors have started to really pick up transdisciplinary research. Education being one of them, public health being another. And so Harvard School of Public Health defines transdisciplinary research as when lots of different investigators across many disciplines. So you can have economics professors working with social sciences professors in sociology, anthropology, psychology, with political science, with engineers, with arts and humanities, so that they can work with community members and community leaders to create innovations to address a common problem. Now, the key here, because this may sound, again, like participatory research. It's a lot of researchers working with the community. But the key here is that it's the common problem that actually drives everything, that there's a unity in understanding. We're gonna come to that topic quite often, this unity in knowledge, a unity in understanding. A little bit more of a revised model comes from, and I'm not going to say this right, but it's Vermeulen and Vites more recently have really looked at this from an international perspective, and that it integrates knowledge across different academic disciplines with academic and non-academic stakeholders. And that's kind of a nicer way to understand it and remember it, to address societal challenges. And to this, they sort of say it's where scientific rigor meets societal relevance. We all do a lot of research in academia, a lot of research. And some of it is really for the purposes of just understanding something more or thinking philosophically about something, defining things, understanding foundational concepts better. And these are all wonderful things. But we're also facing some pretty critical issues in the world right now. I think your director highlighted a bunch of them: poverty, homelessness, food insecurity, women's rights. There are so many different issues that we are facing, both at a country level, a local level, and at a global level. And a lot of the research that we have is starting to get at this. We've been sort of nipping at the sides of it. And what we need to do is collectively come together, both as a scientific community and as a non-academic community, to really start to think about the problem in a holistic manner. So we want to bring scientific rigor. We want to bring our skills to these larger social issues, with the intent of making real change. So, as I said, transdisciplinary research actually is not new. It came about in the late 60s, early 70s, so it's about 50 years old. And it came about from this idea of what's known as the wicked problem. And the wicked problem, by the way, wicked doesn't mean bad in this case. Wicked means malignant, something that's likely to have both immediate and long-term negative consequences, right? Social consequences, political consequences, economic consequences, cultural consequences. The idea here is that we have these wicked problems, and we really need to think differently about how we are coming at these problems. And so probably the one that comes to mind the easiest is the environment, climate change. We have a wicked problem when it comes to climate change. It is affecting so many communities. It is estimated that by the year 2045, the majority of refugees on this planet will end up being environmental climate refugees, meaning that the weather will become too turbulent for people to continue to live where they are. And so they will have to live somewhere else. They will have to move forward. The fact that we would have more refugees from climate change than we would from, say, wars or famine or other things that are happening is quite remarkable when we consider that climate change is something that, you know, we've heard some scientists really push to do something about, but not enough working together interconnectedly across different disciplines. So this is a perfect example where transdisciplinary research can have major impacts at a local level, at a larger scale level, and globally. So a little bit of this wicked problem idea is that we understand that there's these social ills. We want to think about them differently, and we want to bring some scientific rigor to how communities are managing these. So it's a lot of bringing like these really big concepts and ideas down to like a local level if we can. So just a little bit of visualization for those of you who are visual. I love this graphic, and this one sort of explains the different types of ways of doing research. For those of us who've been doing research for a while, you might not have even thought of it this way. So disciplinary research is very simple. You have an academic who stays within their discipline and researches a goal or a topic in that discipline. So if you have someone who's in social psychology and they're thinking about social control theory, they are specifically studying social control theory. So they stay within their discipline, they work within their discipline, and that's great. There's quite a lot of knowledge to be found in any of our sciences and in our disciplines. Second, you have multidisciplinary. Now, multidisciplinary is when you have different researchers across different disciplines who are looking at a common issue, or a common goal. So what does that mean? So let's say we were going to look at things like an issue in social justice. So you might have someone who's a psychologist who might step in and look at a topic from their perspective. You'll have a sociologist who will come in and look at it from their perspective. You might have an anthropologist who will come in and look at it from their perspective, political science who might look at it from their perspective. So it's one topic with folks examining it, but from their discipline alone. They don't necessarily need to cross over with each other. They're not looking for mutual understanding of the topic. They are simply coming at the topic from the root or foundation of their discipline, which is very different actually from transdisciplinary. So we also have participatory. Participatory is when you have folks who are in a specific field or discipline who go out into the community and work with folks across the community, specifically non-academic partners. So this can include local governments, NGOs, citizens, residents, those who are most affected, those who would benefit from change, things of that sort. And they integrate back and forth with knowledge and knowledge sharing. But again, it stays within a specific discipline. Probably this is the one that I think Merrimack College, where I teach, has been doing quite a bit. We have worked with we are based in Lawrence, Massachusetts. So within our city of Lawrence, we have worked with our local police department. We've worked with local residents. We've worked with different folks to do things right now with reforming our police. Police brutality is a major issue in the United States. And there is quite a bit of distrust with our police and law enforcement right now. So we have been working with different community groups and the local police department to try to build more community trust, to build more social capital. But this is very much driven within the discipline of community engagement. So we are not bringing in lots of other disciplines. We are actually working with the community to try to deal with the issue of police brutality and police relationships in our community. Let's see. That then takes us to interdisciplinary. Interdisciplinary is when you have lots of disciplines who are working together towards a common topic. However, what's important about interdisciplinary is that it does not include the actual community. It doesn't have to. For any of you who've ever co-written or co-worked with another academic in a different department or in a different program, that's interdisciplinary. That is when somebody like me, who is a community economic development, my doctorate's in community economic development, I might work with somebody who's in criminal justice. And the two of us might write a paper together about the work that we're doing in Lawrence to reduce police brutality, to bring in more social workers, to try to create better community relationships with police. So in that case, I'm taking the lessons learned from the work that we're doing. I'm working with someone in criminal justice department, and we are actually creating papers on like, what are some of the lessons learned, but we're not necessarily including the community in this. And this is where transdisciplinary research becomes really valuable, because the idea of transdisciplinary is that you do bring in the community. The community are the co-creators and co-authors of the work. They are co-designers, they are co-implementers, they are co-analysts. And this does mean that you have to spend a tremendous amount of time sharing skills and tools and ideas with lots of different folks in the community. But in the end, what you have is a common knowledge and a common set of concepts, as well as the potential to create common solutions that can be implemented. The biggest thing about transdisciplinary research is that it takes interdisciplinary and participatory and melds them together. And the key here is we are not just looking for research and content for the sake of research, but we're looking for actual things that can be implemented, actual solutions that can be done. And so the goal of transdisciplinary research is action. It's not just research. It's to create action. It's to give and co-create and co-implement actual actionable items that are well-researched, based in rigor, and focus on making sure that folks can actually do something with the findings that we have. So somebody just posted in the chat, transdisciplinary sounds the same as multidisciplinary. It does, except when we look at multidisciplinary, remember that people are staying in their own silos, meaning us as academics, we stay in our own silos, right? So staying in our silos means I'm going to look at this topic, but as a sociologist. I'm going to look at this topic, but only as a political scientist. That's where I come from. Instead, this actually is asking us, even us as academics, to step out of our field and to co-learn across fields. Just like we're asking participants in the community to step in and co-learn with scientists, with academics. So the idea is there is no one discipline. There is no one discipline that sort of makes the decision or rules. It's a co-learning and co-sharing of the concepts and ideas that we're shooting for. It does, I'm telling you, when you really kind of get down to it, these do sound very similar, but the key to remembering transdisciplinary is that we are always going to step out of our safety zones. This is a nice way to say it. We as academics love our field. And unless you are in a multidisciplinary field, this is not the way most academics work. Most academics stay within their field of, and they'll fully admit that. If you've been to, I'm sure many of you have been to conferences and people are like, yep, I stay in, I'm talking about this because this is my field. I spent all this time studying this. I spent all this time working towards this. So It is staying, this is asking people to step out of their field and to use the skills from your field to augment and enhance other fields so that we can work with the community. Oh, I'm going to get to the methodology part. Yeah, it's interesting stuff. So I'm just keeping an eye on chat here. So just so everybody knows. So again, to the point that was made, this sounds like multidisciplinary. I'm a visual person. I love this little chart at the bottom. In multidisciplinary, you've got all these different disciplines that kind of come together towards a point, but they stay separate. Interdisciplinary starts to blend them a little bit, but not a lot. And notice how transdisciplinary, they're all kind of on top of each other. That's what we're going for. This is one of those things that we're looking for, like a holistic understanding of a social issue, which that's really difficult. I mean, that is extremely difficult if we really were to be honest about it. How do we holistically understand poverty? There are many different definitions of poverty and how we can understand it, what we're including in that definition, how we might calculate it. But all of those things don't stop us from coming up with a universal understanding of poverty. And within that universal understanding, how can our different disciplines support each other and the community in actually moving solutions forward? Yeah, it's actually pretty fascinating, this field. So what are the goals? End goals for transdisciplinary research are understanding problems and by default coming up with solutions for them, or at least, working towards solutions, but understanding the dynamics and complexity of these issues. I mean, I don't have to tell you that, like, climate change, environmental issues, poverty, hunger, food insecurity, housing crisis, urban sprawl, the loss of agriculture and farming lands. These are all massive issues. They are dynamic, they are complex, they involve people, they involve the way societies move and bend, they involve politics, they involve economics, they involve social capital and social exchange. So these are incredibly complex topics to which we have not really, as a global society, come up with very good solutions. And so, as a result, we want we want to stop the siloing of information. We want instead to think more unified. And to do this, we need to come up with a common conceptual framework. And that is where TDR, transdisciplinary research, comes in. By building a framework together across disciplines, academics and non-academics alike, we can start to think about how to integrate ideas, integrate different methods of collecting data and doing the research, integrate different views, integrate different philosophies, integrate different perspectives, so that we're thinking about solving problems, we're thinking about approaching problems, we're taking action against problems in a more unified way. So there are 4 basic characteristics to transdisciplinary research. One is that all research problems have to be socially relevant. We're not pursuing things that are individualized, super individualized anyway. And these are not ideas that just emerge from academia, right? Again, this is no slight to academia. I myself am an academic. I appreciate actually good philosophical discussion. But the key here is that, what are the issues affecting people in real life? Because while we might be really interested in, how poverty manifests in certain scenarios or in certain political spheres, which political agendas might contribute to poverty more. The fact is that there are still people who are poor. So we need to think about this more from the real life perspective. What is happening on the ground? What is happening in our communities? And so the first and foremost driver of transdisciplinary research is always going to be the most urgent matters in our society. It is always going to be, what is our community facing? Now, this sounds like I'm talking on a global level, but think about our local communities. In some local communities, women's rights are eroded or are a key issue. Rights to education, rights to labor. We've got issues about access to healthcare and whether or not folks have access to healthcare. These are global issues that have local ramifications. So even though we're talking about social issues, big scale, umbrella, it's really about how our local communities are affected by those bigger issues. And they're going to all be affected differently. Communities are going to be affected in different ways because communities have different resources, have different designs. They are set up differently. They are they have different political parties in play. They have different social norms. They have different cultures. So we are always going to be looking at these issues, but we have to look at them. It's the old phrase of think global, but act local. That's really what we're doing here. So that's characteristic one. It has to be socially relevant. The problem drives the research. And we'll come back to that. Second, you are going to transcend disciplines. That literally means for all academics, you have to be willing to step outside of your discipline's understanding of a social issue, because we're looking for unity of knowledge. How does an engineer see an agricultural problem versus someone who is a sociologist versus someone who is a anthropologist? Because we're all looking at it very differently. One of the great projects I get to work on right now is I'm currently working with engineers, mechanical engineers specifically, on how to rethink what they do in community places, specifically environmental justice. So I don't know if many of you are engineers or know engineers, but if you've ever worked with engineers, they are constantly problem solvers. If you tell them, hey, we have an area over here and it clearly needs a bridge, they will design for you the best bridge that they can. They don't necessarily think about whether or not that bridge is going to have any negative consequences to the community in which they placed it, right? That's not what they're there to do. They're not there to necessarily think about that. They're there to design a bridge. So I've been working with engineers, engineering students, and recent engineer grads to start thinking about social and environmental justice and ethics and how that may play into the decisions they make about designing bridges or designing dams or designing anything else that they might be doing. And this exactly gets to transdisciplinary research, because part of that is that they need to talk to the community. They need to talk to people and they need to engage with folks. And for engineers, asking them to engage with the community is something they have not done before. They have not had to do before. They get contracted by the government to go and build a bridge. They don't normally sit down with community members and have a conversation about where the bridge could go. Please don't put the bridge here, for example, because this is where most people fish. If you could put the bridge just a little bit further away, then people would still be able to fish and people would still be able to access the waterways in the way that they always have, or in the way that they need to. So this kind of interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary thinking is really at the heart of TDR. It's the point that for a lot of our disciplines, they haven't had to consider these other aspects because it's not part of what they do. And so for us as academics, this is a lot of rethinking our field. And it's a lot of rethinking what our field sits in as a larger academic world. And we've got multidimensional problems. We need multidimensional thinking. That's what this comes down to. Third characteristic is that, of course, it has to be participatory. So back to participatory research. We have to bring in non-scientists, non-academics. We have to bring in local stakeholders, beneficiaries, users, policymakers, the folks who would implement some of these projects. We want to think about the government. We want to think about NGOs and nonprofits. We want to think about civil society. Who are the groups who are most affected? Who are the groups that would benefit the most? And most critically, we want to think about how we're also enhancing the skills of folks in our communities. Because we have to come at this as equals. Academics and community members are equal in our pursuit of trying to solve problems. We may not be equal in terms of, where we come from, or our backgrounds, or our academics, our credentials, if you will, but we are equal in wanting to come up with solutions. And so in that sense, where we can bring skills and tools and resources and methodology and scientific rigor to the table, it is community members who are also giving us real world implications, considerations, political power, and of course, capitals, social capital, manufactured capital, human capital, political capital, all the different capitals that we need in order to create the partnerships to actually create solutions and implement those solutions. Because it's one thing, I don't know how many of you have worked with communities before, and you come up at the end with this beautiful report that says, here's all the great things we could do. And then someone puts it on a shelf and nothing happens to it. And that happens a lot here, at least in the US, I can say, in Mexico, Canada, some of the other places I've worked, it happens quite a bit. It's a lovely report and it sits on a shelf. No one's implementing it. But the heart of TDR is that we want people to implement it. So the people we want to work with are the folks who can and will implement it. And so we're working with each other. We have to remember that that participatory is not just a nice to have. It's not just that we're being benevolent and giving people skills. It's that we're coming at this as co-creators and equal in wanting to make solutions. Lastly, all of the results of transdisciplinary research, or at least I should say most of them, because some results may not be, but most of the results are going to be applicable. The key here, and this feels kind of funny to say, but the end game for a lot of this research is for practicality, which is, by the way, not at the heart of a lot of our research. Practical measures are not something we often consider when we make recommendations. We're like, oh, well, here's what the research says is some of the best ways to do things. But in the real world, that's not going to practically happen. So how do we create solutions that are practical? And the only way to do that is to continue working with stakeholders. We need people to let us know, well, this is a great idea, but that's not going to work in the real world. So how do we redo this idea so it can work in the real world? And that is the goal. That's the end game. The solution making that we have sometimes means we are not making the best, we're not offering the best solution. We can work together and say this would clearly be the best solution, but it's not going to work. Like that's not going to fly. So instead, this is the solution that we could do. This is the solution that we can implement. This is the practical, pragmatic solution that would actually work in our communities. All right, so just a recap. The idea of transdisciplinary research is that at the same time, we are between different disciplines, across different disciplines, and beyond each discipline, between, across, and beyond. We have to think differently about how we understand our role in academics and what each of our fields and disciplines can do and are capable of doing. And so anytime we're doing transdisciplinary research, it has to be driven by real world issues. You got to go past your discipline. You have to involve the community and multiple participants, and you have to produce practical, applicable results. And to the question that's in the comments about ethics, I'm going to get there because ethics is an issue that we have to think about. So again, visual person that I am, there is a sort of process to this. The process is, of course, you have to co-create information. So this is one of those things where we need to work with folks from the outset. We have to, scientific, non-scientific, across all disciplines, across different community groups. We have to come together and, one, agree on the issue at hand. which, by the way, that can be a tremendous amount of this process right on the outset. Couple things I want to say about transdisciplinary research. It is expensive, meaning it's going to cost you time. It's going to cost you money, oftentimes. It's going to cost you capitals. It's going to cost you social capital and political capital and a whole bunch of other things, because it takes time to build consensus. It takes time to build up skills. It takes time to understand different perspectives and to kind of come to a resolution or a consensus of how you're even viewing the problem. And so even though this image here looks pretty simple, right? You come together as a collective, you decide on what the issue is going to be, then you co-create some solutions, you do some data, you do some analysis, you look at this together, and then you integrate or reintegrate some of that knowledge created into some solution making. And then you test and determine, is that solution making an impact? That sounds simple. But anybody here who's ever done community work and tried to sit with 50 people in a room and try to get them to agree on how they view a topic knows that that is probably the most difficult part of anything you're going to do. So this looks like a pretty simple process, but the majority of this process is just getting people on the same page, just getting people to agree or to co-create and co-define the issues and the problems that folks are facing. So that means we have to have some considerations, like context matters. You're going to have to consider political, social, cultural, economic factors. You're going to have to consider where things sit in the community. Where's the community at? For example, a lot of the work that we're doing right now in Lawrence is a direct result of the summer of 2020, when George Floyd was murdered in Minneapolis. And police brutality has been an issue in the United States for a long time. Let's be clear. Communities of color, in particular in my country, in the United States, have faced police brutality for a very long time. But it really came to a head in the summer of 2020, which unfortunately was also the summer that we were all under lockdown for COVID. And the issues that this has brought up have caused a lot of our communities to have to take a step back and look at our law enforcement, look at our police departments, and try to understand what that relationship is between law enforcement, police, and our communities. So as a result, context matters. Like right now, this is one of the most pressing issues in a lot of our communities because of 2020, because of so many issues that have been in the news cycle, and because so many people are now aware of it. So to a large degree, this is pushing a lot of the interest. Now, if you go to, for example, Texas, and I'm doing some work with engineers in Texas right now, the big issue is water. We have several communities in Texas who don't have access to clean drinking water right now. Their water is either gone because we're in a severe drought, or their water is not safe to drink, and they're under water boil restrictions and things like that because their water is contaminated, and there's been just poor infrastructure across the board. So in this case, context matters. People are concerned about water, and the fact that probably, if I was to say there's one resource on this planet that will be the cause of more wars in the next, say, 20, 30, 40 years, it's going to be water, without a doubt. And so this issue of thinking about environmental change is, in the past has usually been things like agriculture or farming or land and urban sprawl and how it's been sort of cutting into our farmland. Now we're looking more at the lack of water, the lack of drinkable and usable water. So context is always going to matter in how, by the way, the community is viewing different issues and how we need to think about those issues. Second, you've got the societal effects, which means just by doing this type of work, there's going to be some changes to the way society is going to work. There's going to always be these interactions that happen. And this includes, by the way, scientific effects too. There'll be changes to the way we have to approach things. We have to think about our methodologies a little bit differently. We have to think about how we connect and communicate with different community groups differently. And lastly is the innovative methods, which means we have to think multimodally. For a long time when it comes to community work, we were all about the surveys. Just survey people, ask them about their community, ask them what they think about X, ask them what they think about Y, survey, survey, survey. And in some places, we've even gotten good about doing focus groups and surveys. But the truth is there are a ton of different ways that we could be gathering data and information. Is it going to be quite as, simple as a survey? No, not that surveys are very simple, but it's not going to be that clean. But to the idea that there could be a lot of different things that we could gather from that, just thinking differently about how we collect data and who co-constructs that data may give us a lot of insight into how we can co-create solutions. So in other words, what we're really doing here is we're creating real world labs. Now, the key again, why academics are moving towards this is because these multimodal ideas need scientific rigor. That's the bigger issue here, right? Because it's so easy for folks to say, oh, we're just going to do observations in the community. But without a really good rubric or scientific rigor or inter-rater reliability, we leave ourselves open to potentially having a lot of information that isn't very rigorous, and therefore we don't know how to interpret it. And that's a real outcome. So we're trying our best to bring the academic rigor to practical ways of collecting data. So I like this because I think this is a really helpful way of sort of thinking about how the methods come into play. And with this, we can also think about ethics. So one is we have to help folks understand their everyday context. And we have to listen when people tell us their everyday context. We're not there to correct folks necessarily, but we are there to understand that the way we may understand it from a scientific method is not how it works in the real world. So how do we do this? Well, there's data analysis, interviews, observations, but there's also some really cool techniques like, walking surveys, user surveys, asset resource mapping. Like there's some really cool techniques that we can use that tell us how people see their everyday life, how these, and particularly how some issues affect everyday life. Describe and identify different user types. Right? These are co-creation workshops and colloquiums and places where folks can share ideas and learn different disciplines and philosophies. And then there's developing those ideas, the co-creation workshops, the idea that okay, we're starting to see different disciplines are bringing different ideas or aspects to a topic, and folks in the community are doing the same. So let's do data walkthroughs. Let's do some really cool consensus building. Let's do some different types of thematic, exploratory storytelling so that we can start to find a common perspective or a common consensus on how we understand a particular issue. And then lastly is the real world lab. Once we have that, what's a potential action that we could take against this issue? And then let's test that. Let's see how it's doing. Is it improving things? Is it making things better? Is it, do we find that it is having some unexpected, unintended, indirect effects? So this is how the process overall should work. And in there's plenty of places to collect data, to co-create data, to co-devise data, and to co-analyze and understand that data. This again is another way of looking at it. I just happen to love the two headers on this one, which is for us as academics and scientists, our question is always, is it true? That's what we care about. We do what we do because we're trying to figure out, is it true? Is it real? Is that a thing that really happens? In the real world, for community members, the question is always, does it work? So if you want to think of transdisciplinary research in the most simplest forms, it is the combination of is it true and does it work? And while this is happening, we have to co-learn, co-design, co-implement, and co-disseminate. both the academics and non-academics need to do these three things together. And that's asking a lot, to be clear. This is asking a lot in terms of engagement and people being, people investing a lot of time and effort into this work. But again, the end game is that there's a potential for a solution, an implementable solution that people can actually use in their communities. And this also then gets to the question of ethics. So Joe had put in here a question about how is ethics managed? Ethics is managed at the same level in which we would expect ethics in the scientific community. In other words, we try to do no harm, but we also have to consider that most community members haven't probably taken an ethics course or see ethics in the same way we do, right? Because a lot of folks may conflate, for example, ethics and morals, which are actually two different things. So what do we do? Well, one thing we do want to do is for anybody who's in this, who's working on this project, on a TDR project, we would want to do a small workshop on ethics. Who are we considering? How are we considering them? How do we ensure that we're holding to the highest ethical standards, that we are promoting beneficence, justice, that we are thinking about the ways in which we are engaging with each other as well as with the community? What are the considerations that we need to have, and how do we make sure that we're treating people fairly? So this is something that has to be a discussion and frankly a workshop in the very beginning of creating a TDR project. And with that, it's transdisciplinary ethics. So the social sciences have an ethical standard that they hold to, but so do engineers, and so do, applicable sciences, so do arts and humanities. So it's a little bit of understanding the ethical standards across different disciplines and how those can play out in the actual community. So let's talk challenges. There are a ton, I'm sure you're already thinking of them. There's a ton of challenges to this. The lack of definition, the lack of understanding of social issues, because social issues, as we all know, are very complex. And I'm not so sure that people think about them as heck. Probably even in academia, there's some social issues that probably you don't think as much about as others. So this is one of those things where kind of coming to a unified understanding can be very complicated and very it's going to be time consuming. It's a tough thing to do. There's also a lack of awareness or agreement on an issue. And I always like to refer to this one as, it's important to understand that not everybody's truth is the same. This is the one I deal with the most in a lot of the communities I work in. It may be true that we have low-income folks in a community who don't have enough to buy food. So we have food insecurity is a major issue in many of the communities I work in. I work in one community where 1 in 5 kids go hungry every night, for example. In the United States, 1 in 6 kids go hungry every night. And food insecurity is a massive issue in some communities as compared to others, just low-income communities. But what does that mean? What does food insecurity mean? Now, there's an economics definition for it, right? There's also, by the way, a social psychology definition for food insecurity. There's also a public health definition for food insecurity. They're not all the same. So whose do you use? Who do you go by? Who determines what food insecurity is? And more importantly, food insecurity in some places is you don't have food now. Food insecurity in other places is you don't have enough to get you through the week. Those are two different concepts. You don't have enough to sufficiently feed. You have enough to eat. You don't have enough to sufficiently be nutritious. It's a big difference between all of these concepts. And so there's a lack of agreement, even sometimes when we talk about topics in terms of how we even understand what those topics generally mean. There's conflicting viewpoints. And by the way, this is the one where the community is going to have an issue. So heads up on this one. This is not to say that in the academic world we don't, but often in academia, we're pretty good about trying to check our biases. However, not 100%. And communities in particular struggle sometimes with checking their biases, right? Because for a lot of these folks, they live it every day. It's their normal. And that's the other one, normativity. This is where anecdotes become the norm. This is how I live. This is how it's normal. So they don't understand necessarily that that's not how everybody else lives. So normativity and bias are two very big ones that you would have to deal with as a challenge. Then we get into the other parts of the project, which is unclear relationships, right? Between disciplines, between community members, gaps between best practices and real world application. Here's what you're supposed to do according to the research. We can't do that in the real world. So what are we supposed to do, right? So real world application and best practice often sometimes clash head to head. It's not going to happen. Ensuring a high level of empowerment and engagement, that can be tough. Sometimes a lot of community members feel like they're just there to check the box, that we're not really listening to them. We're not necessarily engaging them in really meaningful ways. So that's on us. It can be difficult. By the way, two things to keep in mind about TDR that is really important to keep in mind for those of you who are like me and are evaluators at heart. Transdisciplinary research is really hard to evaluate. It's not impossible, but it is really hard to evaluate. If you think about it, it makes sense, right? Because evaluation is change over time. Where were you in the beginning? Where are you at the end? But because this process can be so messy, because this process is so much of just building consensus, where's the evaluation component here? Right? You can evaluate whether or not a solution and how it's being implemented is being done well. That's a different thing. But the actual process of transdisciplinary research can be very difficult to evaluate, the process of building that consensus. So I just want to put that out there. And the last thing to talk about, of course, as I already mentioned, is it costs. It costs time, it costs money, it costs capital. It also costs your reputation. If you go into this and you're not doing it with the open heart, open mind of really working towards community solutions, really working with community, it will tarnish your reputation. I have seen other faculty wash out because of this, because they had an idea, they were going in, they were going to do something, and the community was like, you're not listening to us at all. And now the community does not want to work with them at all. And so, yeah, that reputation follows. So it is important to understand that it is up to us to walk in with an open heart, open mind, and really come in humbling ourselves, because as academics, that's not easy to do. We got to where we are because we wanted to master our fields, but we're also working with communities who live with consequences. And so, we need to co-develop and co-learn together. But there are massive opportunities, right? For us as academics, there's increased engagement and social societal impact. There's the idea of new partnerships. There's the idea of collecting fresh ideas on how to look at topics that we've been reading about and studying for years. It's a reality check on a lot of the stuff that we do. For the community, there's usually things like improved decision-making. They now have tools to evaluate and reflect on the work that they're doing. They get capacity building. There's better networking, better relationships between universities and or I should say academics and non-academics, but everything has a trade-off. It is important to understand that, for example, as an academic, you may get fresh ideas and you can see how your work could really be impacting the real world. But this is not necessarily going to produce a ton of papers. So if publication is super important to you, this may not be the way to do it unless you want to co-create your publications with community members. And I will say, by the way, there have been some journals who are moving in that direction. There are some journals who are starting to allow for who are starting to allow for like co-created papers that include non-academics. So you'll have a paper that will have like 2 academics on it and 2 community members, for example, and maybe a government person. So there's 5 authors, but it's co-created authorship. There's a lot of journals, I shouldn't say a lot, but there's a few that are really starting to step into this world because they're understanding this co-creation of information and how to get that out there. And a lot of it is process, like here's what we did, here's what we learned, here's how it worked, that kind of thing. Okay, so let me then talk a little bit about, I'm going to give one example that happened in Japan. So the Japan and then Finland was kind of learning from it. But before I do that, couple things. There are 5 steps to getting into transdisciplinary research. The first step is to co-learn. This is where the knowledge is created and shared. Probably going to be spending a lot of time here. Second, pre-development is when you are defining the problem. Now, this is happening at the same time step 1 is happening. So you're sharing knowledge, you're sharing information, you're sharing across your different disciplines and with different community members. You're kind of just setting the stage. Then, while you're doing that, you're trying to define the problem. You're trying to come to a unity of understanding, a unity of knowledge on what the problem actually is. And then you can design the research question. This is the most, I don't know how many of you remember your old research methods classes, but in research methods, we tell students all the time that the research question comes first, and then you design your methods off of the research question. In transdisciplinary research, that's not at all how it happens. It'll always be that the issue comes first, the question comes second, because you have to have unity of knowledge or unity of understanding in what the issue is before you can develop the question. Then there's a continual period of reflection and refinement where you consistently are looking at the process and are we doing things in a way that's going to be most effective? And then you've got conceptualization. This is where we start to develop the questions. And when we develop questions, as many of you as research methods might remember, when you have the question, then you can develop the methodology to research it. Then there's investigation, which is where we collect data and we analyze it, not just as researchers, but also with non-academics. We co-analyze our research, we co-analyze the data, and then we implement a solution. So in Japan, one of the issues that they've been having for a while, some of you may know, is that they are what's called a super aging society. They're aging out. The aging in Japan is a major issue. And one of the big issues that they're trying to figure out is how do we enhance quality of life? And in particular for rural Japan. So they brought in all of these different departments to kind of work towards thinking about quality of life for aging in Japan under the backdrop of rural populations where they're losing a lot of local knowledge because of urban sprawl and because young people are leaving. And so that information isn't being shared. And we have older folks who are passing away. And then at the same time, with all of that urban sprawl, you've got an issue of rural development and sustainability. And on top of this, how do you maintain culture? Like there's a lot of questions here. When you have a super aging society that is being increasingly disconnected from your younger society and is going to need more support, but literally it's like having 2 different lands in the same country. And now Finland is facing the same issue. And so they're learning from Japan and the TDR that they're doing there to sort of explore this a little bit more. So this gives you an idea of like how they are co-creating the actual issue. Aging is an issue, right? But how do we understand this across different disciplines? This is what they came up with the backdrop of the rapid decline of the young rural population and the loss of local tacit knowledge. We question how to balance rural development and sustainability with place-based critical care by integrating rural societies, agri-economics, and cultural landscapes. That is their unified issue. And from that, they're developing questions. Okay, so as I said, topic first, question second, and this will allow for the complexity of the issue to be addressed. Okay, I'm just checking the time and I realize that I'm about to hit the end. So what I will do is, I know that these slides will be shared with you, but I will end here by saying, so what about the community? How do you get consensus? Consensus is not just done by holding community meetings. I don't know how many community meetings you've gone to, but they can be a lot. So the key here is when you're dealing with community meetings, people don't want to just show up and be talked to. I say that with the irony of the fact that here I am on a Zoom just talking to you. But that is not what people generally want, and particularly community members. They want to feel like their actions are important, and they want to feel like they're taking action on an issue. So what does that mean? That means as much as possible, whenever you bring community groups together, have them do stuff. Activities work just as well in educating and increasing knowledge. So that includes, doing community-based data collection, data walkthroughs, participatory asset mapping, SWOT analysis, consensus activities, GIS mapping, photo voice, art-based methods, working surveys. Get people out and doing stuff that will collect the kind of data and information to help build that consensus together. So there's lots of ways to make meetings way more enjoyable for community members, way more actionable, that give us a lot more information. So I had an activity, but clearly we're not going to have time for it. So, and I have a summary, which we've already talked about, but I do want to say a couple last things for you as academics in this work. And that is, there are 3 fields that you are going to want to work on if you want to do this. 1, make sure your intellect and technical skills are up to par. What do I mean? Practice systems thinking. Think about methodological groundedness and be willing to bring in new disciplines to what you're thinking about, how you're actually understanding a topic. Relational, keep working on building trust with community members, with your fellow academics. Managing relationships can take a lot. Practice your ethics, which I mean, most of us do anyway, but take responsibility for a lot of relationships, particularly community relationships. I do this quite a bit. If there's becomes tension between community members and other academics, I often will step in to try to manage and mend those relationships, because I take responsibility for the fact that I want the community to see academics as a co-producer of solutions and not some, entity coming in to direct their lives. And then, of course, there's our own work-life balance, connecting your mind, your heart, and your body, understanding that like communities are systems of people who need and want to solve their issues too. We're all in the same boat. We all want solutions and we all want to do good things. So how do we bring ourselves to the table, understanding that we're part of that community as well? So a couple things that are worth like keeping in mind as academics that we sometimes get pulled away from. It's important to remember that that's part of our learning too. So with that said, I think I've covered just the basics of TDR. I mean, there's a lot more to it and a lot more process stuff to it. But I know I'm like 3 minutes over. If anybody has any questions, I'm happy to answer. Otherwise, I will wrap it up.
Thank you, Melissa. This was amazing. I'm very impressed with you. I hope, is there any pressing questions that anybody has now? And I say thank you to Melissa. I believe you all, everyone say helpful. Thank you. I think I need to have a follow-up webinar with you. We need to organize this early next year if you are willing to do it again. What is this? There's a question. Somebody, Melissa, that you can perhaps answer. A PhD student that is
something that is attainable, given the fact that potential supervisors should come from different disciplines. Is it something that is trending in the global north? So I think I understand the question. So the question is something that is attainable given that supervisors come from different. So are you asking like how possible is this? I want to make sure I understand the question well.
You can switch your sound. I'm sure you can.
Yeah, feel free to unmute.
Yeah,
in fact, I'll stop
unmute.
sharing so we can actually all see each other. Like,
yes, correct, Melissa. That's what I mean. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I think it's a great question. I think, let me just say, my experience has been with some, in some academic institutions, if they are very sort of forward thinking, yes, this can work. I'm going to tell you right now, transdisciplinary research has been something I have seen more younger academics are really into. And I've seen, I think folks who are very much interested in social issues are very into. I'm not going to lie. I think all of you know this. There are plenty of folks who run programs who've been in their positions a very long time and are not necessarily interested in interdisciplinary work. It's going to happen. And so when that happens, here's my hint: go to another school. You don't have to just do it in your school. So I work with engineers at University of Massachusetts Lowell. I work with public health department at Boston University, and I work in Merrimack College with their economic community engagement group. And so between the three of us, we have enough academics who are interested in stuff that's happening in Massachusetts. So you don't have to stay in the same school. Find the folks who want to do this with you. But you are not wrong, because what's implied in what you're saying is that there are some folks who are not going to be on board with this. And you are absolutely right. There are some academics who do not like this idea. You're not wrong. That's a fantastic point. Is it possible? Yes. It's just a matter of finding the right people to come to the table. Next question. How would this model apply to working with practitioners from your own field? Oh, yes. I would say, yeah, there's no limit to the number of practitioners you can have. So urban planning is a really good example, because urban planning contains public health and economics and, community engagement and sociology, psychology, arts. There's no limit to the number of disciplines that you bring in, other than you want to come to a solution. So you don't want to have so many partners that people can't come to, like building solutions. But there's not one solution. There could be, 5 different solutions that you're trying out in a community. So there's a really great example in the Mekong River Basin, where a group of academics and non-academics together were looking at the issue of water. And so they were using indigenous knowledge, arts, and engineering, and a lot of the social sciences to come together to sort of think differently about water usage and how they could use it more effectively, because access to water in the Mekong River Basin has been a major problem in Southeast Asia. So this has been a very successful program. And to your question, I would say the majority of disciplines, believe it or not, that are involved in that are engineers, because they're trying to rethink different ways of looking at, like, the water dams that have been upriver, and sort of how do we rethink water supply, and how do we do that caring about indigenous knowledge about water. Another project is in the Mount Kenya, has a massive project that is a TDR project that's looking at agriculture. And that one probably has the majority of disciplines that are in that are public health, not even agriculture, economics. It's mostly public health folks, but they brought in a lot of other folks. So the public health factor is now looking at agriculture and farmlands, not just for food production and other things, but also as just a form of public health. Like, farmlands are actually good for our health. And so, to your point, it has really been enhancing the way that public health is thinking about agriculture as an aspect of public health. Yeah, there's some really cool projects going on around the world right now. And these are great questions. Any others? Oh, yeah, no problem.
Okay, I think we're run over time, and I say thank you very much. I will share with you all the PowerPoint and the recording. And I think, Melissa, we will invite you next year, please. This was brilliant. Thank you very much.
No